Hi, I'm Jarek. And I used to think my family's silence was just distance. But then my father gave my brother $3 million at our graduation, while I sat 2 rows back with an empty glass. That was just the beginning. They cropped me out of family photos, held a funeral I wasn't invited to, said nothing when my ideas were stolen, then erased my name from the record. But what if I told you the worst part wasn't what they took, but how long I kept pretending I didn't notice? How many second sons are living like that? Right now. It was the kind of morning that felt like it should mean something. Blue skies stretched across Madison, the breeze warm but not heavy. I sat 2 rows behind my family, just far enough to see the back of my father's head and the exact way he leaned toward Cassian during the ceremony. My chair felt hard. Not because of the material. It was the usual cheap plastic they always used at graduation events, but because it anchored me in the space I didn't quite belong. The University of Wisconsin-Madison had called our names, handed us papers, and now it was done. When the speaker stepped off stage, applause erupted. Families hugged, photos were taken, laughter echoed. My family didn't turn around. I watched as my father straightened his tie, patted Cassian's back twice in that familiar way he always did before making a speech. Sylvia, my mother, stood beside them, smiling gently, not quite looking my way, but not avoiding it either. I stayed seated for a while longer. We gathered under a white canopy near the administration building. A catered lunch, small floral centerpieces, and dozens of bright-eyed future CEOs. I hovered near the edge of a group, but never quite joined. The champagne flutes clinked. That's when Alaric stood up and tapped his glass with a butter knife. Sharp, clean, commanding attention. Today, he began, we celebrate 2 milestones. First, the academic achievements of my eldest son, Cassian, who has not only excelled in business theory, but is already shaping business reality. Cassian chuckled modestly as cameras turned toward him. And second, Alaric continued, as his father, I believe in giving our children the tools to build their own empires. That's why I'm proud to announce that Rowan & Co. will be backing Cassian's startup with a $3 million investment. This is the future, and he's ready. Applause, real, heartfelt, thunderous. People stood. My father lifted his glass toward Cassian. I stood still. My own flute sat untouched, still empty. I glanced down, expecting someone, anyone, to notice. But no one did. When Alaric finally lowered his glass, he met my eyes briefly. Not coldly, just as if I weren't the reason he paused. My mother leaned over, as if to speak. Then she didn't. She returned to her seat and adjusted the napkin on her lap instead. I smiled. Because that's what they expect. Smiles and silence. The post-toast mingling was a blur. I found myself standing near the table of shrimp cocktail and mini quiches. An aunt, I forget which side, approached and asked, "So, what are your plans now, Jarek?" I gave a vague reply. Looking at options, might do something in analysis or strategy. She blinked, nodded as if waiting for more, then turned to greet someone else mid-sentence. I watched her walk away without taking it personally. Not anymore. Across the tent, Cassian laughed with 3 alumni and 2 faculty members who used to forget my name. His glass, refilled twice, glinted in the sun. Mine remained dry. People moved around me, sipping and swirling and floating through conversations like I wasn't even in the same dimension. I held the stem of my empty glass, feeling its chill but not enough to numb anything. The longer I stood there, the more I realized. This wasn't about omission. This was a pattern. "Hey, bro," Cassian's voice broke through. He was smiling, already half turned toward the next person before I even replied. "Congrats," I said. "Thanks, man. You'll find your lane too, you always do." He meant it, in the way someone means good luck to the guy who didn't get the job. Then he walked off. The tent felt smaller after that. Or maybe I just felt larger, like I no longer fit the corner they'd assigned me in this story. I slipped outside, past the lawn, and sat on a bench facing the fountain. From that angle, I could still hear them. My family, my father's voice rising again in explanation of Cassian's plan, the business, the backing. Sometimes the loudest message is delivered in silence. And my glass stayed silent all afternoon. The reception was held in a lakeside hall with glass windows that stretched floor to ceiling. Everything about the setting was polished, silverware aligned, linen napkins folded with an edge sharper than most people's words. And yet, the moment I stepped through the door, I knew exactly where I stood in this story. Not front and center, not even in the wings, just somewhere backstage. There was a small table set up near the entrance labeled Family Keepsakes. Guests were encouraged to take home a photo montage from the morning's ceremony, printed and framed. I took one without thinking. It was labeled, in gold font, Our Family's Big Day. I carried it toward the edge of the room, peeled back the paper wrapping, and stared. There were 4 photos, one of Cassian tossing his cap, one of my father shaking hands with the dean, one of Sylvia wiping away a tear while smiling, and one of Cassian again, laughing mid-speech. I flipped it over. Nothing. No 5th photo. No sign I had even graduated that day. A cousin passed by, peeked over my shoulder and said, "Oops, maybe you moved too early from the group shot?" She laughed politely. I didn't, but I remembered clearly. I hadn't moved. I stood right there, between my parents, smiling for the camera like everyone else. That photo was taken. It just didn't survive the edit. They didn't crop me out by accident. They simply chose the story they wanted told. I walked toward the refreshment table, placing the frame face down along the way. The clinking of glasses and low chatter filled the room. Every 10 minutes, someone announced Cassian's next meeting, handshake opportunity. I overheard one man say, "Cassian's got the whole package, brains, polish, and backing." I'd heard that phrase before, back when I was the one with a GPA 2 points higher and a resume with internships stacked like Lego bricks. Back when people said it about me, until they stopped. The memory of the seating chart surfaced mid-bite of a too-dry chicken skewer. I hadn't thought much of it that morning. But now, with this frame in hand, it struck different. I hadn't been seated near my family. I was placed in the 5th row, with acquaintances of acquaintances, beside a woman who kept checking her watch and a man I'm fairly certain was someone's +1. Every time the camera panned over the audience, the broadcast landed on my parents flanking Cassian. I wasn't in a single frame. Funny how people think invisibility is a curse. Sometimes it's the most strategic position you can have. By late afternoon, the crowd had thinned. Sylvia passed me once near the coffee bar. She looked tired but content. Her eyes met mine for a second too long, as if she wanted to say something. But whatever it was, she swallowed it. I stepped outside, the air crisper than I expected. Lake Mendota shimmered behind the trees. I found a quiet bench under an oak and sat, the photo frame still in my lap. I stared at the image again, letting the weight of its message settle. There was no space for me in that gold-lettered hour. The word family was elastic, stretching just far enough to fit the narrative, but not far enough to fit me. Back home that evening, I didn't unpack right away. Instead, I pulled up the ceremony replay on the university's website. I watched Cassian's speech, his confident tone, the applause. Then I paused the video at a wide shot of the audience. In the very back, barely visible, was a blur of navy blue and a set of hands mid-clap. That was me. I rewound. Paused again. Zoomed in until the image broke apart. Still me. Fuzzy, small, irrelevant, but not gone. I opened a fresh page in a notebook and began writing. Just bullet points, dates, things I remembered. Times they had done this before. Moments they had cropped me out, not from photos, but from decisions, opportunities, acknowledgements. Start logging moments, I whispered aloud. If you spend long enough at the back of the room, you start to hear everything people say when they think you're not listening. The first time I realized the idea wasn't his was at a networking event 6 months later. It was one of those tech meetups in downtown Milwaukee, tucked into the back room of a repurposed brewery. The room buzzed with recycled ambition and startup jargon, filled with the kind of people who always seemed just a bit too impressed with themselves. I wasn't planning on staying long. I'd come for the free coffee and maybe a contact or two. I was standing near the pastry table when I heard a voice behind me. "Jarek? From Midwest State?" I turned. It was Owen McAllister, someone I hadn't seen since senior year. We'd shared a few classes. Smart guy, solid memory. We chatted a bit. Light stuff. He asked if I was still in finance. I asked about his app. Then he gestured across the room where a giant display had been set up for a presentation, the screen already rotating through branding slides. "You working with Cassian now?" he asked. My eyebrows lifted. "No, why?" He pointed to the screen. "That's the capstone project you presented junior year. I remember because you gave it right before mine. Same title? Same 3-tiered model?" The room suddenly felt colder. The words hit like a delayed punch. Not because I didn't believe him, but because part of me already knew. I didn't say anything then. Just nodded, mumbled something about interesting timing, and walked out before the presentation even began. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed with my laptop balanced on my knees. It took me less than 2 minutes to log into my old student account. The university kept our files archived for 5 years post-graduation. I clicked through the folders until I found it. My capstone submission. Local link. Bridging independent retail with urban professionals. The title Cassian used for his startup? Urban link. Same interface diagrams, same model, slightly tweaked colors. I opened his company website in another tab and began comparing the two. Word for word, slide for slide. My language had become his sales pitch. But this was more than plagiarism. This was erasure. He didn't just take my concept. He repackaged it, presented it to my father, and secured funding for a life I wasn't even allowed to apply for. I had been marked absent before I even showed up to the interview. I didn't call Cassian. I didn't confront anyone. I started screenshotting instead. I saved files, created backups, time-stamped copies. Quiet work. Methodical. The kind of behavior people mistake for calm when it's actually just preparation. The next morning, I went to the university. I didn't tell them why. The alumni office was quiet. The woman behind the desk was polite, typing quickly, asking me to spell my last name twice. "I'm just verifying project records," I said. "Graduated 3 years ago. Finance and entrepreneurship track." She pulled up the file. "1 second." I watched her eyes skim the screen. "According to the system," she said, "your senior project submission is blank, no record." I stared. "That's not possible." She shrugged. "Sometimes things get archived improperly, or if a student withdraws a submission after approval, it doesn't log." I never withdrew anything. "Maybe talk to your department chair?" she offered, already preparing to move on. I left the building with that same slow burn creeping through my chest. Walking back toward the parking lot, I passed a bench I used to sit on between classes. I sat again. 3 years later, same bench. The sun was lower now, slicing between campus trees, casting long shadows. My phone buzzed with a weather alert. I ignored it. All I could think about was how perfect the strategy had been. Cassian didn't just steal my work. He made sure it couldn't be traced. He'd scrubbed me out like a bad pencil sketch. I wasn't just invisible anymore. I was being erased. I forgive you. But I can't keep pretending I don't see the cracks anymore. That was the last line I wrote in the email draft I never sent. I stared at it, fingers hovering above the keyboard, but something inside me stalled. Sending it would mean I still believed there was something left to fix. 3 days earlier, I had driven back to the house I once called home. Not out of longing or curiosity, but under the pretense of returning an old book my father had loaned me years ago, some dense legal volume he insisted I read, when I was still foolish enough to think pleasing him mattered. It was just after 6 p.m. when I pulled into the driveway. The porch light hadn't been turned on yet, and the house looked as it always did, impeccable, expensive, hollow. Sylvia opened the door. She looked surprised, but not unhappy. "Just returning this," I said, holding up the book. My voice was neutral, polite, a stranger's tone. She stepped aside. "He's in the study," she murmured, then walked toward the kitchen. I didn't plan on staying long, but my feet moved before my brain did. I followed her. She was slicing lemons at the counter, the kind of task people do when they're avoiding eye contact. I watched for a moment, then asked quietly, "Why didn't you say anything?" She froze, knife still in hand. I continued, "When Dad made that toast, when he announced the investment, when everyone looked at Cassian like he was royalty and I was just someone who wandered in from the parking lot, why didn't you stop it?" Sylvia set the knife down slowly. Her hands trembled just enough to notice. "Your father wouldn't have listened," she whispered, "and I didn't want to make things worse." I nodded once. Not in agreement, just acknowledgement. Then I turned and walked out without another word. Back at my apartment, the silence was different. Not peaceful, just quiet in a way that made you hyper-aware of every sound. I opened a bottle of water, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall for what might have been an hour. Then the email came. Subject: "I'm sorry from Sylvia Varner." Message: "I should have said something. I should have protected you better. I'm sorry, Jarek." I read it twice. A third time, it was short, like a post-it note left on a fridge. The kind of apology that arrives after the damage has been cataloged and archived. Words don't rewind moments. They only echo. The next morning, I took a walk down by the lake. It was something I used to do with Henry, my grandfather. We'd walk in silence for most of it, and he'd only speak when he had something that really needed saying. I missed that kind of economy. Now I walked alone. The breeze rolled off Lake Michigan with just enough chill to make my fingers ache. I shoved my hands in my coat pockets and stared out at the water. Ripples moved like static on a forgotten TV channel. I thought about the family photo that didn't include me. The empty champagne glass. The project Cassian had repackaged as his own. The silence of my mother in that kitchen. All of it added up to a truth I didn't want to name, but couldn't unsee. Somewhere between the bench and the water's edge, I pulled out my phone and opened the email again. I hit reply. I wrote 3 words. "I forgive you." Then I added, "But I can't keep pretending I don't see the cracks anymore." I didn't send it. I watched the waves instead, letting the cold seep in a little deeper, letting the silence do what it always does. Speak in ways people can't. Some goodbyes aren't stolen. They're edited out, like I never had a place in the ending. It was a Friday morning, late September, when the email came through. I was making coffee in the kitchen, the news murmuring in the background. Nothing special on the schedule. I sat down with my laptop, opened my inbox like I always did, and there it was, subject line cold as stone. Sad news about Henry. The sender wasn't Alaric, wasn't Sylvia, wasn't Cassian. It was a cousin I hadn't spoken to in 3 years. I clicked. Just wanted to let everyone know. Grandpa passed away late Wednesday. Services will be private. Hope you're all doing well. I read it 3 times. Reread the part about the date. Wednesday. Today was Friday. 2 full days had passed. My phone had been on. My number hadn't changed. They hadn't forgotten. They'd decided. There was no call. No text. No message saying, "Come quick," or even, "You should know." He was gone, and I wasn't even considered part of the moment that mattered. I closed the laptop, stared into my coffee. It had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. I didn't cry. Not then. Instead, I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my call log. Nothing from Dad, nothing from Cassian, no missed calls from Sylvia. And then, almost by accident, I tapped into my voicemail. There it was. A message I hadn't seen, time-stamped 2 days before Henry passed. I hit play. The sound was grainy, like he'd been sitting outside again, using that old flip phone he never wanted to replace. "Jarek, it's me. Just wanted to talk. I'm proud of you. Not him. You stayed true. I'll explain more later, okay? Call me back." Click. I sat down on the kitchen floor, phone still in hand. The message played again. And again. I didn't cry. Still couldn't. I just sat there with Henry's voice bouncing off the walls of my apartment, louder than anything I'd heard in weeks. The next morning I packed a small overnight bag and drove west. Not toward the cemetery. I hadn't been invited, remember, but to the cabin. Henry's place, the one no one wanted but me. It sat by the water like it always had, untouched by the drama that had consumed the rest of the family. When I arrived, the front porch looked exactly as I remembered it. 2 wooden chairs. A swing. 1 empty coffee mug still resting on the small side table, like he'd just stepped inside and never came back out. I sat in the swing. Let the boards creak beneath me. Let the silence settle. The lake was calm. No one else was around. I didn't speak aloud. Didn't need to. The air was heavy enough with words left unsaid. There's something about grief when it's wrapped in silence. You don't yell. You don't sob. You just notice everything. The way the light falls differently. How the wind doesn't carry your name like it used to. I walked to the dock, stood where he used to fish, and watched the fog lift slowly off the water. My hands in my jacket pockets, my grandfather's voice still echoing in my ears. He had chosen me, and they had made sure I wouldn't know until it was too late to say thank you. I sat on the steps of the cabin and pulled out my phone, opened the text app, typed in Sylvia's name, then Cassian's, then Alaric's, deleted them all. This wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine. And for the first time in my life, my last name didn't feel borrowed. The envelope arrived a week after Henry's funeral. Cream-colored, thick, the kind of stationery that suggests it matters. My name was written in blue ink on the front, the cursive careful but not elegant. Formal. A letter that wanted to be respected. It wasn't from my family, not Alaric, not Cassian, not Sylvia. It came from a law firm based in Sheboygan, one I didn't recognize. I opened it, unfolded the single sheet inside, and read the words that made me sit down without realizing I'd done it. You are invited to the official reading of the last will and testament of Mr. Henry S. Rowan. I checked the date and time. 2 days from now, 9 a.m. They hadn't told me there was a will. They hadn't told me anything at all. But Henry had. I drove north that Thursday morning, passing quiet farms and towns that hadn't changed much since the 70s. The law office was small, brick, tucked between a bakery and an antique store, with a rusted tricycle in the window. I walked in and gave my name. A young woman led me to a conference room where 3 men in suits and 1 woman in glasses sat around a polished oak table. They didn't look up when I entered. I recognized none of them. The oldest of the group stood and extended a hand. "Mr. Jarek Rowan. I'm Douglas Stern, Mr. Rowan's personal attorney." I shook his hand, nodded. "I didn't realize this was happening." He gave a small smile. "Your grandfather requested privacy." We sat. No introductions from the others, just the rustle of paper and a low hum of the air conditioning. Mr. Stern cleared his throat. "This is the final, legally binding will and testament of Mr. Henry S. Rowan, signed and witnessed 6 months ago." He began reading. "To my grandson Jarek Rowan, I leave my full stock share in Rowan & Co., all my liquid assets, and full ownership of the property at Lake Mendota." A chair creaked. One of the younger lawyers let out a soft exhale. I sat still. No reaction. My body wouldn't give them that. To my remaining family, I offer the knowledge that sometimes silence is louder than applause. There was a pause before Stern continued. "He also left you this." He reached under the table and handed me a small envelope. On it, written in the same blue ink, were the words, "For your eyes only." I stepped outside, walked down the sidewalk until I found a bench near the bakery. Cars rolled by slowly. A couple argued gently about pie flavors behind me. I opened the envelope. "Jarek, you stayed true. I watched the way they looked through you, talked past you, measured you against standards that were never yours to begin with. You were never invisible to me. They always wanted the spotlight. I gave it to them. But you, I give you the spine. I didn't leave you money. I left you the match and the map. Burn what you need to. Rebuild what matters. And don't waste time proving anything. Just build something worth inheriting. You chose one son for show. I chose the other for soul. Henry." I folded the letter carefully, then again, tighter this time. I didn't cry. Not from shock, not even from gratitude. I just sat there, the paper warm in my palm, and felt a kind of clarity I hadn't known in years. This wasn't an inheritance. It was an indictment. And for the first time in my life, my last name didn't feel borrowed. Power speaks softly, but so does refusal. 2 days after the will reading, I heard a knock on my apartment door just as I was pouring the last of the morning coffee. It wasn't loud. 3 knocks. Measured, familiar. I opened it to find Cassian standing there, hands in the pockets of his blazer, not a hair out of place. "Hey," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" I didn't answer, but I stepped aside. He walked in like he owned the place, surveying the room as if assessing an asset gone underutilized. He didn't sit, just stood near the window, glancing at the skyline like he was trying to decide how dramatic he needed to be. "Dad's not happy," he said finally. "The board's rattled. People are asking questions." I leaned against the counter, arms folded. "About what?" Cassian turned. "About control, about transition, about you." His voice dropped slightly. "This doesn't have to be messy, Jarek. We can fix this quietly." I stared at him. He didn't blink. "Henry, Grandpa," he corrected himself. "He was emotional at the end, sentimental. We all loved him, but this? It's not sustainable. You know how these things go." I raised an eyebrow. "These things?" Cassian took a slow step forward. "Look, I get it. You want to honor his wishes. Fine. But the IHOT company? That's a legacy Dad built. You weren't even on the trajectory until the letter. And now we've got investors nervous, media poking around, and a whole board waiting to see if you're going to blow it up from the inside." He paused, measured his next line like a man choosing between weapons. You don't want to burn bridges, Jarek. You're not that kind of man, right? I didn't move. Didn't react. Just nodded once. Opened the door again. He walked past me without another word. I closed the door gently behind him, then locked it. The next morning, the email arrived at 6:12 a.m. from the Rowan and Cumber legal liaison, a name I recognized but had never exchanged words with. Dear Mr. Rowan, it began, in light of recent developments, we encourage you to consider the long-term health of the firm and the family equity it represents. Attached was a PDF titled Sentiment Summary, Board Discussion. It wasn't an attack. It was worse, diplomatic, precise, and thinly veiled. Reassignment of major shareholder control to a beneficiary with no prior senior-level engagement poses risk to strategic cohesion and external trust relationships. The board suggests exploring transitional advisory roles or partial redistribution. I closed the laptop, walked to the drawer in my desk, pulled it open slowly. The letter from Henry still lay where I'd placed it the day I returned from Sheboygan, the ink a little smudged from where my thumb had lingered too long. I read it again. Just the final line. You chose one son for show. I chose the other for soul. I sat down, grabbed a pen, and wrote on a torn scrap of paper from the notepad I kept by the phone. Let them wonder what kind of man I am. I folded it, tucked it under the base of the letter, and returned both to the drawer. They expected a reaction. What they got instead was the sound of someone not playing the game. The man who built the empire had just shattered the table trying to hold on to it. The article dropped that morning. Quiet, no big headlines. Just a sidebar piece buried in the business section of the Milwaukee Ledger. Title, Was Henry Rowan Coerced? Family Council Raises Ethical Flags in Inheritance Transfer. Sourced anonymously, but the language was unmistakable. Polished, rehearsed, full of legal haze that smelled exactly like my father's brand of warfare. I folded the paper, slid it into my messenger bag, and buttoned my jacket. The board meeting was at 9. Downtown, the conference room of Rowan & Co. gleamed as always. Glass walls, hardwood floors, a table that stretched the width of legacy and ego. Everyone was already seated when I arrived. Alaric sat at the head of the table like a general disguised as a diplomat. Cassian, to his right, avoided my eyes. Sylvia wasn't there. She never was, not in these rooms. A woman from the legal team stood to begin her presentation. She clicked through slides, a timeline, scanned documents, even a video of Henry from just weeks before he passed, lucid and firm as ever. We believe this confirms the testator's full mental competency during the drafting of the final will, she said evenly. This video was recorded with consent and witnessed. Alaric didn't flinch. Not at first. Then the lawyer said something about the letter. Henry's letter to me. The words, clarity of intention, hung in the air. That's when it happened. Alaric slammed his palm flat on the mahogany table. The echo cracked through the room like a whip. Papers jumped. 2 coffee cups tipped. The water carafe trembled but didn't fall. My father, he roared, was manipulated by this ungrateful child. He stood, breath ragged, eyes burning holes through me. This rewrite of the company's future, this slap in the face to everything I've built. It's a con, a sympathy stunt dressed in legalese. No one moved. Cassian looked like he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the air. I didn't flinch. I just said quietly, there's a camera in that room too. Silence. No one asked which room. Everyone knew. The lawyer looked down. One of the board members, a woman who'd stayed silent most of the meeting, closed her binder gently and slid it back into her bag. Alaric's chest rose and fell like a man just realizing he'd been holding his breath for a decade. And then he stormed out, muttering under his breath, one hand still trembling at his side. The room didn't relax. It simply reoriented. I remained in my seat. 30 seconds passed, then 60. Finally, 2 board members, both older men I barely knew, approached me as people began to file out. "Mr. Rowan," one of them said, not looking me in the eye, "whatever happens next, stay steady. That's the part most people fail at." The other nodded. "You didn't flinch. That matters more than you think." I gave a slight nod in return. No smiles, no handshakes. Outside, the city moved on like nothing had happened. But inside that boardroom, something had shifted. The man who once controlled the table had shattered it, and no one rushed to fix it. The man who built the empire had just shattered the table trying to hold on to it. But empires don't fall quietly. They come down one chair at a time. The quarterly board meeting at Rowan & Co. started like every other, except this time I sat at the head of the table. No one made a grand announcement. No trumpets or toasts, just a small, clean nameplate that read, Chairman Jarek Rowan. Alaric's seat had been quietly moved to the right flank. There was no nameplate waiting for him. He stood when he entered, paused for a half-second when he saw the new layout, then sat without a word. His usual routine, straighten the tie, clear his throat, dominate the agenda, was conspicuously absent. Cassian leaned toward the assistant at the far end and whispered something. I couldn't hear it, but I saw her mouth the words, "It's been approved." Then, like a final nail in an old door frame, she walked across the room and placed a new nameplate in front of Alaric. It read, Strategic Advisor, Non-Voting. Cassian's eyes followed it as if it had betrayed him. He shifted uncomfortably, adjusting the lapel of his suit jacket, but said nothing. I didn't smile. I simply nodded toward the first slide on the screen. The meeting began. We reviewed quarterly performance, legal updates, and the next stage integration of ESG compliance policies, Henry's pet project in his final years. Every eye in the room was on the numbers, but every mind was on the shift in the room. The chairs had moved. So had the gravity. When it ended, I gathered my notes in silence, took a final sip from my coffee, and stood. That's when Cassian caught up with me in the hallway. Don't do this, he said, his voice taut. You're breaking us apart. I looked at him. Really looked. His eyes weren't angry. They were tired. We were never together to begin with, I said flatly. He stepped in closer, dropping his voice lower. Dad's falling apart. He's not the same. You don't understand what this is doing to him. And what about what he's done to me? I asked, quieter now. You think I wanted this? You think I planned for any of it? Cassian exhaled. Just split it. Half. We'll both walk away. No lawyers, no press. Just walk. I shook my head gently. Cass, I walked away already. I'm just not turning back. He didn't move, just leaned back against the marble wall like he needed it to hold him upright. I stepped back, offering no comfort. He looked at me, still in his tailored blazer, still clinging to the idea that everything could be polished, fixed, rewound. But there was nothing left to rewind. I adjusted the cuff of my simple gray sweater, took one last look at him. He looked like a prince, stripped of his throne. And I didn't feel like his subject anymore. Some wars don't end with explosions. They end with a silence so loud no one dares fill it. I wasn't planning to go out that morning, but the apartment had felt a little too still. Like even I opened it without thinking. Sylvia stood there, hair pinned back like she'd tried to tidy. He air was waiting for something. So I ended up at a quiet cafe off Prospect, the kind that hadn't changed in 20 years. Sunlight through dusty blinds, a bell that rang when you pushed the door, a waitress who called everyone Hun. I ordered black coffee, no cream. As I waited at the counter, someone tapped my shoulder. I turned. "Owen?" I said. He grinned. "Still have the same hairline? That's impressive." We laughed, the small, tired kind. We hadn't seen each other since graduation. I gestured for him to sit. "I've been reading," he said after a few minutes, "about the company, your name showing up more. And that mess about the will." I said nothing, just waited. Owen leaned in slightly. "You know, I remember that pitch. The local link model. You presented it in Entrepreneur Capstone, right? I was right after you." I nodded. He stirred his coffee, eyes drifting to the window. "I saw your name on the draft board. Then Cassian presented something awfully similar 3 weeks later. Changed the branding, sure. But it was yours." My stomach didn't drop this time. It didn't need to. I'd already buried that part of me. "If you ever need someone to confirm that," he added, voice quieter now, "I will." I smiled. "Thanks, Owen. I won't ask you to speak. But thank you for remembering. We finished the coffee, talked a bit more. Jobs, kids, the kind of things people mention when they've already said the one thing that mattered. Back home, the apartment was still quiet, still waiting. I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, typed a new email to all board members, exec committee, and Rowan & Co. senior staff. Subject: no redistribution message. Grandpa trusted me. That's final. I hit send, no sign-off, no explanation. Then I reached for my phone, opened every family group chat, Rowan Core, Sunday Brunchers, Family Legacy, and deleted them all. I blocked Alaric, then Cassian. Sylvia I didn't block, but I muted her. Then I powered off the phone entirely. The snow had started falling, light at first, the kind that danced before it landed. I stood by the window and watched it coat the street in slow silence. A vibration buzzed against the table. The phone, despite being turned off, somehow felt alive. Ghosted energy. I ignored it. A few minutes later, it lit up again. Cassian. 3 messages. One read, "You don't have to end it like this." Another simply said, "Call me." Alaric called twice. No voicemails. Sylvia's message came through last, her voice cracking as she whispered through tears, apologizing again, saying she just wanted peace. But I didn't listen. Not anymore. I poured myself a glass of water. Let the quiet stretch across the room like a blanket pulled over old furniture. I didn't feel victorious, just still. Some wars don't end with explosions. They end with a silence so loud no one dares fill it. Love doesn't always end. Sometimes it just finds a quieter room to live in. I was folding laundry when I heard the news anchor's voice cut through the usual static of the early evening. My back stiffened before I even turned to look. On screen? Cassian. The lower third caption read, "Rebuilding after loss, an exclusive with Cassian Rowan." He looked the part. Trim suit, navy tie, a touch of silver at his temples the camera adored. His voice was measured, soothing, like a man who'd weathered a storm and was now here to teach others how to sail through it. "Families fracture," he said, hands gently steepled. "But business must go on. It's what my grandfather would have wanted." I stood by the kitchen table, arms crossed, watching in silence. The host praised his composure. The comments running beneath the video described him as admirable, graceful. A man who carried himself with dignity during uncertain family transition. He was losing everything, but somehow he still got to keep the spotlight. I muted the TV. It was barely 20 minutes later that the knock came at the door. Herself, but didn't finish the job. In her hands, a small wooden box. "I don't want to stay long," she said. I needed to give you this." I stepped aside. She entered quietly, The box clutched like something fragile. She placed it on the coffee table and sat on the edge of the couch like someone waiting for a verdict. Inside the box were old photos, family birthdays, a few school awards, and one, near the bottom, me, age 9, on Henry's shoulders, both of us laughing like the world didn't know how to hurt yet. "I kept these," she said, eyes fixed on her hands. "I didn't show them to anyone. I don't know why." I didn't interrupt. Let the silence settle. "I was scared of losing both of you," she said finally. "And I did." She looked up, eyes moist but not pleading. Just tired. "Do you hate me?" she asked. I took a moment, then answered calmly, truthfully, "No, but I don't know where to put you anymore." She nodded, like she already knew that would be my answer. We didn't talk about Alaric. We didn't talk about the company. There was nothing strategic in her visit. Just a mother with a box of photographs and a son who no longer needed to sort through them to know who he was. When she left, I didn't watch her go. I closed the door softly, sat back down, and opened the box again. The photo of me and Henry stayed on the top. I looked at it for a long time. Then I slid it into the drawer by the bookshelf. Not out of anger, but clarity. I didn't hang it on the wall. I didn't need to. Love doesn't always end. Sometimes it just finds a quieter room to live in. There are no more chapters, just choices now. It was late February when I made the drive to Henry's cabin one last time. The roads out of Madison were nearly clear, but the trees that lined the path to Lake Mendota still wore a soft coat of snow, untouched and honest. I left the car at the edge of the tree line and walked the rest of the way in boots that had belonged to him once. Tucked in my coat pocket was a legal envelope. Inside, signed documents, notarized and final. I wasn't bringing power with me. I was bringing release. The pines stood silent, tall, protective. Familiar. The same forest that watched me grow up in the shadows of someone else's name. The same one where I'd once built a wooden post with Henry, just off the trail near the north bend of the lake. It was still there. A little more crooked now. A little more weathered. But standing. I knelt down, brushed off the snow, and removed the envelope. The papers inside would launch the Henry S. Foundation for Second Sons, a non-profit funded by the Rowan and Cumber Legacy Trust. The legal team had drawn it up exactly as I instructed. No mention of the Rowan family name, no ties to Cassian, no need for Alaric's signature, just a quiet start to something louder than them all. The press release went live that afternoon. The headline read, "New Foundation honors overlooked voices in business, the Henry S. Foundation for Second Sons." Beneath it, a simple mission statement. For those who weren't seen, but kept standing anyway. By the time it made its way across inboxes and news alerts, I was already walking back toward the car. Cassian texted me an hour later. "So this is how it ends?" I replied. "This is how it starts." Back at the cabin, I had one last thing to do. The wooden post still bore the mark we'd carved in our early teens, a crooked H+J etched with a pocket knife and teenage conviction. I pulled a small brass plaque from my bag and nailed it just beneath. It read, "This forest raised a man when a house only raised a name." Then, from my backpack, I pulled out the old compass Henry had kept on his desk. It still worked. I placed it at the base of the post, nestled into the snow and pine needles. I stood there for a while, let the wind move around me without touching me, let the quiet say everything that needed saying. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel victorious. I felt done, and maybe, for the first time, whole. As I walked back through the trees, the sky began to dim, casting long shadows that didn't scare me anymore. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about being the kind of man who doesn't need to be seen to stand tall. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking through this journey with me. Looking back, I've learned something I wish I'd known sooner. Silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it's a warning, a test, a space waiting to be filled. Not with noise, but with courage. For a long time, I thought staying quiet made me stronger. But strength isn't measured in how much you can swallow. It's in knowing when to speak, when to walk away, and when to build something that doesn't need permission. Maybe you've been the second son, the quiet one, the one who was told to wait, to be polite, to disappear gracefully. Maybe you've been overlooked in your own family, at work, or even by yourself. But here's what I've learned. You don't need anyone's spotlight to shine. Sometimes you build your own lamp, and it burns longer because it's fueled by truth. So now I ask you, have you ever felt invisible in the place you called home? Have you ever had to rebuild your worth, not for revenge, but because you finally realized you deserve to take up space? Tell me your thoughts. Drop a 1 in the comments if this story touched your heart, or let me know where you're watching from. If this video didn't sit right with you, that's okay too. Let me know why and what you'd do differently. We grow through stories, especially when we disagree with them. And if you believe stories like this matter, if you want to hear more voices that usually go unheard, then please hit that subscribe button and join me, because the next chapter might just be yours. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.